Welcome in the name of Christ. What a joy it is to gather on this Palm Passion Sunday. I want to remind you that one of the eligible first readings is the story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem triumphantly, riding on a donkey, and people laying their palm branches of accolades before him. The scene will change, and years ago the church made the decision to move this from just a celebration of Palm Sunday into Palm Passion Sunday, because so many people don't do the through the week services, and this year it's particularly important because those won't really be at least a gathered option, and so they would miss what Jesus really did for us. If you go only from a triumphant entry in Jerusalem to resurrection, you miss the level of suffering that Jesus did for our sake. And so today we're going to be focusing on the Passion story. And what I've done is something a little bit unusual, at least for me it is anyway. What I've done is I'm going to be reading the Passion story and then making comments as we go along. Before that, I believe and I hope that you will have heard the other lessons to be read for today. But for now, we begin with prayer. Send your Spirit, Lord, to open our hearts. These powerful words are words that you have given us, so help them to transform us. Amen. Judas agrees to betray Jesus. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he began to look for an opportunity to betray Jesus. Betrayal. Something most of us are familiar with in some way. Either we can remember a time that we felt betrayed by someone, or maybe we can remember a time that we betrayed somebody. Most betrayal is kind of grounded in self-centeredness or self-preservation, and that may have been what it was for Judas. On the surface, it looks like Judas wants money more than Jesus, and that will end up being a real difficulty for him. But I think for us, it gives us an opportunity to rethink our own priorities. What would we do for money? In this day of meism and all kinds of focus on money, maybe we need to ask, what things would we do for money if we want to fully understand what Judas did? The Passover and the institution of the supper. On the day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he took his place with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him, one after the other, "Surely not I, Lord." He answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." He replied, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to his disciples, and said, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sin. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Some things we should notice about this. First of all, the preparations for the supper are very clandestine. When would a man be carrying water? It seems like such a almost a spy-like espionage kind of setting for this. It means that they've planned ahead and they know what they're doing, and it's not going to be something that is done in the expected way. And by the way, I would invite you to get rid of your Da Vinci ideas of the Last Supper with Jesus and the 12 around him. Passover meals had to be whole families. So all of these folks would have had their families there to celebrate the Passover. Would have been a much larger image than what we realize. Then comes the 2 episodes of saying, "Surely not I." What we learn is that when Jesus says that he will be betrayed by someone, all of the disciples say, "Surely not I." What that reflects is their willingness to see that within themselves they have the capacity to betray someone, that it is possible, and they recognize that about themselves. But then when Judas says, "Surely not I, Rabbi," that reflects a lie, because he knows he's already betrayed Jesus for money. But the most startling thing of all about this scene is that Jesus continues. He institutes what we came to call the Holy Supper, Holy Communion, Eucharist, the number of names that we have for it. He institutes that, and he gives it to all of them. He gives it to them knowing that Judas will betray him, that Peter will deny him, and that the rest of them will desert him. There could be no sin that would keep Jesus from inviting them to the table. This is who Jesus is. He brings them to the table. And the key to understanding that is his words, that this is for the forgiveness of sin. And by the way, the term in the text, many, in ancient Greek means everyone. It's an interchangeable term for everyone. So you're invited, and you never have to worry if you've sinned too much or done too many wrong things to be included. This is our God who knows what we are, knows what we've done, and brings us the blessing of forgiveness anyway. Peter's denial foretold. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all of the disciples. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep scatter. And what we're going to discover is that scattering begins almost right away. The sheep feel lost. And that's why Jesus reminds them immediately in this setting that he's going to be raised. And as soon as he's raised, they're to meet him in Galilee. He's providing them the hope that they need. Peter promises not to scatter. It's a promise he cannot keep. And that's because his only hope will be in Jesus' own plan. Jesus prays and is betrayed and arrested in Gethsemane. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away for a second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, Let us be going. My betrayer is at hand." While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way?" At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the scriptures and the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Gethsemane is really the beginning of the passion of our Lord. It begins with this agonizing prayer. And any one of us who have ever been in a situation that felt difficult or intractable or just too much for us to bear can surely relate to the agony that Jesus experiences there in the garden. He pleads with his Father, the God of the universe, to let this pass. But he also says openly, "No, if it's your will, I'm going through with it." It's a willing death that Jesus goes. And then the second part of the passion really comes about in the fact that his disciples cannot stay awake. This is the beginning of the scattering. The one and only thing he asked them to do was stay awake, and yet they cannot do it. That's a form of scattering, when we're not attending, when we're walking away, when we're asleep at the wheel to the needs and cares that God places on our hearts. That's a way of scattering. And the third part of this passion comes in the form of a kiss. What worse betrayal is there than to be betrayed by someone who you believe loves you? And the kiss represents that. Why was it even needed? Jesus was present. He would have been known. It's a way of affirming this is the right one. But it is also a slap in the face of the kind of love that Judas was expressing. And sometimes we need to look at the kind of love that we express, whether it is truly unconditional and steady. And then there is the fight for Jesus. This would have been done in any group of insurrectionists. If Jesus had been a person trying to actually overthrow the Roman government with force, his followers would have stood up and fought, and they would have had a good chance. This was a fairly large, not highly armed group of guards from the temple. But this is not Jesus' way. And one of the most important things we need to learn from the passion of Jesus is that Jesus is not there to kill, he's there to die. That's a very different image than the world. If you look at power in the world, you almost always find those who are powerful are those who are willing to kill. But Jesus' power comes from his willingness to die. And then this part of the passion concludes with the image of all of Jesus' disciples fleeing. They leave him to deal with this on his own. Jesus before the high priest. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, in whose house the scribes and elders had gathered. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus, so that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses?" "You've heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you?" Whenever you have this group, high priest, scribes, and elders, what that means is that's the Sanhedrin. That was the makeup of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a court, and it was considered to be the high court of the land, sort of like our Supreme Court would be. So Jesus is brought before the highest court in the land. Now there's some interesting things about his trial. First of all, it's against Jewish law to have a trial at night. That's an interesting fact because this trial occurs at night. Secondly, it has to be a unanimous verdict for a capital sentence, and the people have to sleep on it overnight and come back and affirm. They don't do that either. They have to have 2 witnesses in agreement. They don't have that. They have a number of false witnesses who come forward, but they don't agree on their story. But finally, the truth about Jesus comes out. He said that the temple would be destroyed and he would raise it in 3 days. He wasn't talking about the temple of Jerusalem. He was talking about the temple of his body. But he did say that. And he is actually the Messiah and has claimed that for himself. So it turns out that the things that they had against Jesus actually were the truth about Jesus. And that reveals to us that they are so far from God. Because had they actually known God and read the scriptures and understood all of that, they would have known that this is the very one that God was sending. But they find him guilty, and they give him the death penalty, and they take him away, and they take him to Pilate. And when they take him to Pilate, they have a really big problem, because only a Roman governor can actually cause an execution, and blasphemy is not a capital crime in Roman law. Somehow, between when they leave the trial in the chief priest's quarters to when they arrive at Roman governor's Pilate's home, they concoct a whole different charge. They find him guilty. Their error is not understanding the truth and not knowing God. And their error is they're on the wrong side of this. Jesus is tried, betrayed, and sentenced. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you're talking about." When he went out of the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to curse, and he swore on an oath, "I do not know the man." At that moment the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times," and he went out and wept bitterly. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I've sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It's not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money." After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for a potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now at the festival the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time there was a notorious prisoner named Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they'd handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I've suffered a great deal because of the dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and have Jesus killed. The governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with this Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" And all of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I'm innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him, and they took the reed and struck him on the head. And after mocking him, they stripped him of his robe and put his own clothes back on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. So Peter fails. He fails at the smallest provocation, really. 2 little girls, first of all, saying, "Weren't you with him?" In another text, somebody recognizes his accent as being Galilean, so there was a kind of an anti-Galilean sentiment to it. And it's interesting to note that the soldiers called the changing of the guard in the middle of the night. When they rang the bell for the changing of the guard, they called that a cockcrow. So modern scholars believe this has nothing to do with coming up to dawn. It's that time of the changing of the guard by the Roman soldiers that really marks Jesus' recognition that Peter is going to deny him. If you really think about it, what Peter and Judas do is really quite similar. Judas does it for money, but Peter does it out of fear. The real difference between the two of them is how their response unfolds. Judas cannot forgive himself. He repents, but he cannot accept forgiveness, and so he goes and takes his own life. Whereas Peter goes back to the community and accepts their forgiveness and is embraced by the community. And so it's a reminder to us that being willing to accept the forgiveness that Jesus brings into our lives is the center of everything we do and the hope for our futures. Now we need to look at the leaders a little bit. They're absolutely complicit in what happens here. All of them are complicit. They know this complicity truly in their hearts because they refuse to take back the silver pieces. They know that's tainted money, it's blood money, and they don't want to handle it. And in that, they think they're keeping themselves from being tainted. But it's really their act that taints them. It's not the inability to touch the money that makes any difference. And when they do this, they think they are safeguarding the future of their nation because they were afraid of Jesus. They thought he was going to stir up a rebellion. Then you take Pilate. Pilate is a wily character. Pilate's reputation among all of his fellow governors was that he was a really bad fellow. It's thought that Pilate got assigned to Palestine because he was not very likable. He was cruel. He did a lot of very cruel and devastating things. And yet the depiction of Pilate is hard to read and understand. What we think we know is Barabbas was an insurrectionist. That would be a person who would kill a Roman soldier walking past him, or even a Jewish citizen if they thought they were complicit. So he definitely needs to be executed in the Roman view. So Pilate uses the comparison between Barabbas and Jesus as a way of finding out how much support Jesus has. And when no one tries to protect Jesus, Pilate says, I can kill two birds with one stone. I'll execute Jesus. And it's highly likely that in the next few minutes, Barabbas will be rearrested and executed. So Pilate really gets what he wants. And as to the washing of his hands, he says that it means that he is innocent. However, what we know is that that's how you sealed a verdict in first century Rome. It was like the way a judge in our courts would hammer the gavel as the end of the case. So washing his hands is a sign that the death penalty has been given, and it's no longer on Pilate's plate. It's up to them to see to the death. And by them, he means his soldiers, because that will certainly happen. He's agreed with the death sentence, even though he could have said no. He could have just had Jesus flogged. There's extreme cruelty in this event. The beating that Jesus endured was beyond imagining. Even the fact that they took off the cloak and put on his own clothes was done so that blood would congeal and start to form a scab, and then when they got him to the cross, they would tear it off and open up all of the wounds. They were quite gifted in causing pain and suffering. The crucifixion, death, and burial of Jesus. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled this man to carry the cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they'd crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Then they sat down there and kept watch over him. Over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." Then two bandits were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him. He saved others. He can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he wants to, for he said, "I am God's son." The bandits who were crucified with him also taunted him in the same way. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, and about 3 o'clock Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once, one of them ran up and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it for him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now when the centurion and those who were with him, who were keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly this man was God's son." Many women were there also, looking on from a distance. They'd followed Jesus from Galilee and provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. So Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new grave, which he had hewn in the rock. He then rolled a great stone onto the door of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember what that impostor said while he was still alive. After 3 days I will rise again. Therefore command the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may go and steal him away and tell the people he's been raised from the dead, and the last deception would be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it secure as you can." So they went with the guard and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone. The inscription, King of the Jews, is actually right. Jesus is the King of the Jews, but he's a different kind of king than the world was looking for. Jesus was not the king coming to kill, but rather the one coming to die. Those who taunt Jesus, it's interesting because really the kind of taunt that they make is very similar to what we heard from Satan in the wilderness when Jesus was tempted. The idea Satan is pushing in these taunters and mockers is to convince Jesus, come down. Don't go through with this dying, because if you do, salvation will be at hand. Their willingness to participate in that mocking shows really whose side they're on, where they are. And the world taunts us as well. We also get tempted to turn away from God. There's a couple pieces in the story that I think are profoundly powerful. One is the darkness that comes before the death of Jesus. If you think back to the time in Egypt of the plagues, there were 10 plagues. The last plague was the death of the firstborns of Egypt, and the plague that preceded it was the plague of darkness. So I believe that the darkness that comes before Jesus' death is a mark of this is the death of God's firstborn. And I think it's helpful for us to remember that God also grieves the brokenness of humanity in such a way that it brings on this darkness before the death of the firstborn. The other thing is the words of Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These powerful words remind us that when Jesus dies, he dies for more than just our sinfulness. He dies also for our God-forsakenness, which would be what would happen to us if we died in sin. So what happens there on the cross means that because Jesus bore our God-forsakenness, we'll never have to bear that. We won't have to be separated from God. And then it is powerful to imagine Jesus actually being buried in a new tomb, because it would have been against Jewish law for someone who died on a cross. That makes their body defiled. So they really would not have been eligible to be in a tomb. They would have had been in that blood field or some other place of burial. But here we see someone with the courage to go and get Jesus and bring him down and place him in his own consecrated tomb. So we who are followers of Jesus often get called to do things that the world will not honor, but that are truly honoring of God. I think this powerful story in a deeper understanding really helps us to see the absolute magnitude of the power of the resurrection. Will you pray with me? O Lord our God, we thank you for your promises which sustain us now in this time of turmoil. Help us, Lord, to turn to you and to trust you. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Lord, many people are afraid. We are afraid. Still our fears. Help us to keep our fear in perspective with your fear-shattering love for us. Where fear paralyzes us, lift it. Where we pretend that there's nothing to fear, help us to understand the actual fear. Keep close in our hearts those for whom this is a deep risk, the vulnerable, the elderly, those in ill health. Remind us also that the suffering caused by this will not be just for those who are sick, but will include those who lose their jobs and those whose retirement is lost in the stock market, businesses that will be forced to close, overworked doctors and medical personnel. Sustain them and to help them, not only to do with what they are called to do, but to know that you are with them. Lift into the minds of researchers a cure and a vaccine and whatever else is needed to see us through this time. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Lord, we pray for Resurrection Lutheran. Help us to see what you would have us do and to trust you now. Open the hearts of your people that this congregation will continue sustained until the time that the virus has passed and until the coming of a new pastor. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. We pray for Madison, Hanover, and the surrounding communities, for children out of school everywhere, for our state, Indiana, and the states around us, and for all those who care for others, and all who put their lives on the line to help us. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. We name before you all those in need of your particular care and healing. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. We pray for our nation and the world. Bring peace and healing to your world, O Lord. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. I invite you now to join together in your homes in the prayer of our Lord.